is the geopolitics and the body politics of knowledge. So where is knowledge made, by whom? Can it speak, cannot speak in academic knowledge production?
I'm Fien de Doncker. I'm a second-year PhD student at IDIS as well, and I'm studying glacial erosion in the Swiss Alps and also in Greenland. I'm really happy to be here to discuss about equality and diversity at this university.
Okay. Well, thank you all, members of the panel, for taking your time to have this discussion with us this afternoon. The idea is that we'll start with some questions that we've come up with as a panel to discuss amongst ourselves. And then after about half an hour or so, we're happy to take questions from people watching out there at home in Zoom land. So please don't hesitate to write your questions in the chat at any time, and I will make sure that they're asked to the appropriate person on the panel. Also, indeed, if you would rather ask your question with voice, just indicate in the chat, and in about half an hour I'll open it up to anyone who wants to turn on their microphone and camera and ask a question. So to get started, I was very interested, Gerta, when you said that you mentioned that your idea against about the extinction, the reason for the extinction event at the end of the Mesozoic, it was difficult to get this accepted at first, and indeed this impact idea was quite sort of profoundly, I don't know, accepted or well known in the literature. Do you think that you had an extra barrier to overcome or an extra challenge to get your scientific ideas accepted, also because you were a woman in science?
I think to begin with, in 1980, this theory was proposed by a Nobel physicist, Ruiz-Villanueva, and he was a tremendous force in science, and particularly in building the bomb, that sort of thing. But I think, like with everybody, or most people who win a Nobel Prize, they feel that they know everything about everything. And everyone else is sort of what they call us as paleontologists, stamp collectors. So there was one person at the time, a younger professor at the University in Virginia, and he had proposed already several years earlier that Deccan volcanism caused climate warming that was detrimental to organisms and probably caused the mass extinction. So he basically destroyed the guy within 2 years. Not only threatened to destroy him if he ever talked about it again, but also sent in his envoys to his department chair, and he even talked to the university president, so the guy didn't get promoted. And then the guy got ill, basically had a nervous breakdown, and he never recovered.
Oh.
Because he was humiliated at every meeting, every time, in every article, in everything. And Alvarez set this as an example to get rid of all his opposition. And he had done this for a physicist also. And so I was starting in just on this mass extinction, basically a few months before this theory came on. And at first I was excited, and then I thought, oh, I am not going to get into this for at least 5 years, because otherwise I would either be destroyed or jump on the wagon. And I didn't want to do either. So I waited 5 years, and I thought it would all blow over, and of course it's still not blown over. And then I went in. I started something else immediately, and within 1983, I was invited by this Nobelist to a meeting where they, because of a paper that I had published in Science, which was that there were multiple impacts, more like 36 million years ago, but no mass extinction.
Right.
And for this guy, it was the critical part, because nobody had shown that multiple impacts occurred. And I could show that they were there at nothing and really extinct. That he ignored. And it was a meeting really with all the big guys, just 12 scientists, and then the room about this size was lined with all these other people who could not talk, just listen. But it went anywhere from the director of the National Academy of Sciences on down. So the first thing that I realized was every time they were claiming that the mass extinction was due to the meteorite impact, everyone was agreeing. And I would say, but I'm not studying this yet, but I know the literature, and there is so much against this idea, and there is so much evidence that comes against it. And then the novelist Luis Alvarez would just stop. And it was more like a bird just flew into the window and disrupted the meeting. And then after I stopped, he would continue. I was completely ignored. But after a while, he was more and more irritated. And when I had to go up on the podium to tell why we had no mass extinction, but we had multiple impacts, he leaned back and he said, Gerta, don't bother us with your data. We don't want to know it, and we don't need it.
Oh.
Wow. So that was my first encounter with them. And while he never publicly tried to destroy me, all his henchmen, of course, did. So that's more or less. And then from then on, he, by 1992, virtually everybody that was ever criticizing that theory was destroyed. And so then the question was, should I just drop out, like my husband said I should,
Right.
or should I continue? And I'm a Swiss originally, from Cavin and from the mountains, and they're hard heads. So I decided I would go on. So that's it.
Well, that's incredible. Thank you for sharing that with us. And where do you think I mean, it takes a huge amount of strength and resilience to face a room full and indeed a field full of people who just don't want to hear the data. And so where did you find this strength? How did you deal with this sort of opposition?
Well, again, I think it's just growing up in a small village, isolated, and not believing and trying to figure out what life is about and what the truth is and what are fairy tales. And I thought they had fairy tales.
Yeah.
And so, yes, it was tough, and yes, they tried to destroy me, and yes, I had even death threats. But I couldn't give up. I never was one to give up. And especially when I was convinced I was on the right path. So it's not something I never advise my students to follow my path. But in the end, they did anyway. But I try to keep them away because really, really awful. You have to have a certain amount of independence and don't care about what people think about you. So I was sending an article around from basically a position statement by the Geological Society of America, which came out, I think, a year or two ago. And I thought it was very much to the point. I will read a few things later on in the discussion that I think everything we are saying, what happens to women, happened to me and much worse.
Yeah.
So it's really something that's still going on.
Yeah.
Not so much against me, certainly from the impact side, it still is going on that, because they're fighting for their lives, academic lives. And I have won in the end so much from what I used to call the silent majority, the ones who could no longer speak up.
Yeah.
And now the next generation come up, and is mostly involved in looking at mass extinctions and volcanism and what it does. So I don't want to take any more time.
No, it's fascinating, clearly, to hear about your experiences, and I think hearing about people's experiences at all our different career stages helps. Having these discussions over and over really helps give confidence to people who might be questioning themselves or, be looking for a source of strength. It's not easy to say, oh, I don't care what people think, or whatever people struggle with. So thank you really for sharing your experience.
Also, I should say, it's not just once you have a PhD and you go on in your professional lives. I think we have, 2 graduate students here? And I'd like to tell you, it already starts at that time. When I was in grad school, I joined one of the deep sea drilling cruises. And this one was off Japan, and it was half the crew was Japanese and half was Western. And I was there to tell the age and the environment of the course they brought up. And I found out that while we were drilling the trench, Japan trench, at 4,000 meter steps, at one time up can come cores that have a beach deposit. And so the question is, how do you have a beach deposit at 4,000 meter steps in the Japan trench? And I said it had to be what I called a swallowed up island. That it simply went down with the downgoing slab and then scraped off. But the Japanese were not happy with that because they had already published pre-data of what they were going to find. So they were the first ones. And my finding was completely against them. So I would get other envoys come to the lab and tell me to withdraw, to change my mind.
Wow.
And I would say, look, I can show you the data. No, you don't want to see it. Just, if you don't withdraw, you are going to be in danger. I said, what exactly does that mean? He said, you will drown.
Oh.
And I said, how exactly am I going to drown? And he said, you will be thrown overboard.
Oh.
Bad things can happen. And then I had the next one. So I was shocked. I thought, you can easily be thrown overboard. I was working the night shift. There's hardly anybody around. So I was worried. But then I thought, okay, should I just give in? Or should I call him a bluff? And then they sent the next one. And he did the same. And then the next one. And then the next day, the Western co-chief came and said, you've created a war. How sure are you about this swallowed island? And I said, I'm about as sure as I would get. And then he said, really sure? And I slammed down my coffee cup and spilled it over. I said, okay. He said, I'll support you. You don't have to fear him anymore. I take care of it. But that was my first rather miserable experience.
That sounds miserable, but you found an advocate, at least someone who supported you in the end.
Yes.
At least in that situation.
Otherwise, I probably would be overboard.
Yes, you're sitting here, so you obviously got through it.
Yeah.
Incredible. So that's an example of a very obvious case of harassment, death threat. I mean, I hope none of us have to face this in our daily lives anymore, and I hope the situation is improving all the time. But maybe we could open the question more broadly to the panel. What sort of barriers are there still for women in the geosciences in particular? I think, for example, in geosciences, there's often a field component, which can be a barrier for some people. Women may be perceived as not as strong or able to do field work and maybe not be selected for those types of positions, but there's many other barriers. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in and talk a little bit about the barriers that we still face, or maybe if Gerta wants to mention barriers that are disappearing, being positive and seeing what's getting better.
I don't think the barriers are disappearing yet.
Yeah.
They're not. I think it will take a lot. But first, I would like to hear from you. Maybe we start with the graduate students. What are your worst experiences?
Like on the field or
anywhere?
I
start with the field.
Yeah.
It's the easiest part.
On the field, I find it often difficult to be taken seriously. I feel like my male colleagues are taken very often way more seriously, and when we were in Greenland, for example, I always got the questions, where are the potatoes? When will we start cooking? Or when can you start cooking? Should we go for grocery shopping? While my male colleague thought, oh, look at this core. What do you think it means? Or, oh, look at this profile. What do you think it means? And sorry, it makes me a bit angry, as you can hear, but these are still like very present in the field, I feel. And
why did you not answer them? How about you go shopping?
I did, but then I think that in the field, very often it's like a very hostile climate, especially in polar regions. And I was already very stressed, like figuring out the whole field trip, organizing the whole thing, and if all these questions keep on coming in from all the different positions, it feels as if you carry the whole responsibility for the field trip, which for me, for example, but everybody reacts differently, I think. For me, it makes me just like shut down and like lose all my confidence. So that is why I think it was so interesting that you said how important it is to have someone who supports you. Because on that field trip, I felt like I was lacking that support. And so if I would say something that would help for field trips, I think it is to work on group dynamics before leaving, especially if you have very young scientists who don't have a lot of experience. I think it's important to establish boundaries and to explain all the tasks that everybody has to do.
I think that's a really good suggestion. Often in the field, people seem to drop the formalities of language that we are more able to maintain in a university environment. But we're in the field, you're with the whole group 24/7. You know, sometimes people, aren't as respectful or get lazy or something. And it's a frustrating barrier. I've experienced as well in the field. I've been told, you know, like, hurry up, you're always so slow, like, oh, stop whining, just shut your mouth, and, you know, like this kind of thing, literally, I've been told in the field, like, not even asked stupid questions, just told, shut up, what you say doesn't matter. when I was a graduate student as well, and it's an age where you either let it bring you down or you say, no, actually my opinion does count, and you keep talking the best you can. But I think it is a good idea to think about the dynamics in the beginning, and to, if it means bringing an extra person along, you know, so that you don't have a solo effect of one woman in a group of men, or something that makes the situation a bit more comfortable and tolerable. Be a really good suggestion.
Yeah, maybe I can add, because I recently have been involved in collaboration with colleagues from the US and from Europe. They invited me to write a comment on the role of female scientists who did work. We have focused on the time when, during pregnancy or caring for young children, and so the challenges that we may face during this time. And just by discussing among us, we realized that what is really important is the network, and have a really good network and colleagues there, not only in the field, because sometimes during this time life, we might not be able even to join the field trip. But I think the role of the female scientists during this time may change slightly, but it should be still put in the right place, and maybe we just adapt a bit our tasks. But of course, we should not be left out, or particularly during this time, but in any time in our career. So network, as usual, is
Nice thing about being an academic is we can also drive a lot of what we actually want to do. And not all fieldwork has to be in Greenland in very remote areas. We could do something where we only have to drive half an hour, which you could easily do while pregnant or with a small child. And those fieldwork experiences can lead to just as valuable data. And indeed, with teaching experiences, we don't have to take our bachelor students to the most hardcore field sites. We could do something that is more inclusive to people who might not have this sort of rugged, macho side to them. I mean, what we can count as a field experience is so varied, and there are rocks everywhere. So we can think of adapting. In my own career, I did adapt a bit what I wanted to do for my research at the stage where I had a young child, because we kind of have the freedom as an academic, so use it to fit your life stage and make a better balance.
But I think this is a particular challenge in geosciences, that we tend to emphasize some landscapes versus other landscapes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If it is not remote and pristine, it's not as valuable.
Yes, which is something, is just a bias we could.
But there is another thing to it. The students you want to attract to it, you're talking about maybe not as macho, but they really want the excitement. The foreign culture, the terrain, something an experience they haven't had. And it's actually, I've been leading my field trips every year, and they've been very successful. And I would only take 12 to 15 students with me, but 100 would apply and to take the course. But from the university, from the department out, they didn't want more because they had to pay for everything. So it was great experience. It's also bonding among the students and with the instructors, and it actually changes your perception and the way you go forward in the education. Very much. The fact that you had to start doing all the organizing, that's unfortunate. But usually, when you have someone that you usually don't use the graduate students to do that, usually use somebody that has passed that stage. It's not very fair what they did to you. because then they automatically will seeing you as the one who has to take care of all these incidentals of bring me lunch and we need water and this and that. No. I think it's good to go local, but most of your students will be much more excited to go to Tunisia or Morocco or Mexico or God knows, or India for that matter.
Offering a balance of both is probably the way forward, because there's lots of branches of geosciences where it doesn't even have to start in the field, or the field is a more minor component, and those sides of geosciences are just as important. So
emphasize that it is hands-on learning.
yes, of whatever kind.
Yeah, I just think that no matter which terrain you choose, there's always the problem of the toilets, especially for women, and I think it's an important topic to talk about. For example, on the boat, we didn't even have a toilet. It's like a bucket that you put in the little cabin, and you like have to shoo everyone out, like say, get out of the warm boat, go stand in the cold while I pee in the bucket. So very often, like also when I was in my master's or my bachelor's, when you are on your period, for example, or just when you have to go to the toilet for male colleagues, it's so much easier to do than for female people. So I think that an important thing to think about for field work in general is toilet things. And one of my colleagues, Floriana, she actually wrote an article about it in the feminist journal, and it's really good, and I'm really in favor of such initiatives.
I totally agree, especially on a learning field camp for students. If you have 30 people and half are women, maybe statistics don't always support half are women in geosciences, but a good proportion are still women. I always try to make sure there's a bathroom break, an actual bathroom break every 5 hours. Because as you say, if a woman's on her period or whatever, I mean, there are physical needs that have to be addressed and should be able to be addressed with privacy and some degree of comfort. And thinking just of things like that, it's not a little thing, but I think it's not a consideration that field camps always have taken into account. Okay, so do we want to hear from anyone else on this topic about barriers in general, thinking beyond the field, maybe?
So, as a student, I didn't face any specific challenge to study in geoscience. For example, in my class, there are 7 men and we are only women, but they are open on, I think, good, and even in the field camps, they care.
So they were good.
Yeah.
That's great to hear, yeah. We don't want you to have bad experiences. You don't want to have bad experiences.
I just noticed that often in the PDF file or in the classes or something like that, it's often quite man on. But why not use human for including everyone? Or there are some words. I think words can hurt people, and sometimes words is not used as they can use. So there are something like that too. We notice that's more a man connected than a woman, but in generally in my classes that's so what.
Yeah, it's one of these sort of unconscious biases. It's not as like in your face as like someone threatening your life or you know, but like this sort of subtle language things where maybe a woman's opinion isn't listened to or taken as seriously in a meeting or in a course. People tend to talk over women more. It's like the accumulation of these smaller things that are hard to get past.
Language, we use masculine language, and why not using epicent or better inclusive language? Something like that we can, I think, better
than what is it actually. But in a fire tank or like that, for sure it's good.
So do we want to maybe shift the focus from barriers, but away to like how we break barriers or move beyond them? And just another question, I wanted to hear who do people see as role models? What inspires them to think about equality issues or inspires them in geology? I mean, Gerta's story inspires me from what I heard today, I have to say. But one of my heroes, I'm more working in the Cambrian, was Françoise de Brenne, who's now in her 90s. She's a specialist in archaeocyclid sponges, and she's just an incredible force of knowledge. She collected so much data. She went to the field all over the world for decades, at a time where women were going to Siberia on cruises to collect corals. And her attitude to it all was just, well, I did what I had to do to get the science done. She told me, oh, sometimes I'd bring my husband and people would talk to him as if he was the professor, not me. And she's like, I didn't care. I just told him what to say. I just wanted to get to the rocks. I wanted to see the fossils. And she just had this great attitude of resiliency and strength. One of my role models in the field who inspired me to go on. So I don't know if anyone has other role models they want to share.
Well, I do have. I actually have, I think, 3 role models, and 2 of them are women, and one is a male scientist. And of course, what I value the most is the work they do and the science they do, but also their honesty and kindness and the joy they show when they work. And for me, this is had a profound impression. And I think this is probably the reason why I also continue in academia, because I was really lucky to meet some of them at the very earliest stages during the masters. And so role models is probably, if we don't have the proper or balanced role models, we never can really realize that we can follow the same path, right? So having the women models is really important, but also the kind of underrepresented persons too.
Anyone else? Maybe I have a question concerning models. First of all, I don't have your strengths. I think it's a bit frightening what you have met in your career. I mean, wow, it's impressive. In terms of model, so I'm not a paleontologist, I'm an urban geographer, but I'm interested in to study models. And in paleontology, there's the figure of Marie-Anning. And I know that in UK, Marie-Anning has become a kind of feminist symbol. Did you heard about it?
Actually, no. I'm a bit embarrassed to talk about this and to admit much that I've never had a role model. And I'm sorry about that. I would have loved to have one. But it just never happened.
Yeah.
And in many ways it was perhaps because I was too much finding my own way. And the older generation that would have been role model, I didn't really know any women. I was one of the first women at Stanford. And women were, we were mostly sex symbols anyway. Well, it's true. They chose us for our looks rather than anything else. At least that's what we heard. I was one of 3 women that they admitted to Stanford first.
Wow.
And the first day, we came in, the three of us, and walked up this big curved stairways in the Geosciences. I thought that, gee, you know, it was half dozen professors, it was a welcoming guy, but instead they were laughing and saying, hey, for the first time we didn't do badly, looked pretty good.
Oh,
So anyway, the point is I never had a role model. In some ways it was because I was rather independent. The other way was, and I should say I was independent because, let's face it, I only started my education when I was just 23. And because I left Switzerland when I was 18, and there was no chance of an education in Switzerland for me. Because I come from a family of a dozen kids and very poor. There was no chance. And I was told I could be, when I told them at 10 years when you had to say what you wanted to be, I told them I was going to be a doctor. So they sent a shrink. And the shrink told me that I could never be a doctor. I could be a maid, a sales girl, or a dressmaker. And that was it.
wow.
So I decided that Switzerland was not for me. So when I made myself, I worked hard, but once I found, I emigrated, I traveled around the world for 4 years. It's when I got to the US, which I never really liked, the outside, was never going to stay there. I was taking, I went to San Francisco, and it was, I think most of you are too young to know what the flower children days are. Of 68, that's the hippie days. And I found out that I could get a free education. So that was it. But it's the lack of a role model. If I had role models, I think my career would have been easier. But I always chose projects that were controversial or became controversial because of me. Because I looked always for the underlying truth. I always started out studying something that nobody else had looked at. Because I didn't want to just follow somebody's views. And I think that made me more enemies, even from grad students who was on, days on. And I think it's probably for that.
I think it's safe to say that you are a role model for people and for people you supervise over the years. So
That's true.
even if you unfortunately didn't have a role model
I
yourself.
certainly didn't have any.
Yeah.
But yeah, I know I'm a role model for many of them.
And how do you sort of navigate equality issues, you know, in that respect, as a mentor, as a supervisor of people, like, you know, how do you approach it, you know, for yourself, you approach it with the strength and resiliency that you've talked about and just saying, you know, I believe in the data, I believe in myself, and going for it. How do you navigate the transition to being a role model and transmitting that to the people you work with?
And I wasn't really trying to be a role model.
Okay.
I just was trying to teach them how to do science and how to be true to themselves. Namely, don't believe what people tell you to believe. Believe what the evidence is that you bring about, and then go and stick with it, as long as you believe that you're still right. There is one thing that my advisor, who didn't advise me very much, but he did tell me one thing. He said that never jump on a bandwagon. And that was the one thing. The other one was always do what you think is right. And I was, I don't know how to phrase it. But anyway, the point is that he left me. Oh yes, it comes back to me now. He said, it's about the worst people are the ones who, I think it's in paleontology, it's a field of scoundrels. Scoundrels who believe that you are supposed to follow a certain route. And that was something that I thought was very interesting. But in any case, the point is that I had a bit of an unusual way of going about things. By just following my interests and not being told what I'm supposed to believe, but go with what the evidence is. And I worked hard, because for everything, and that will go for all of you women, for everything, when you do science, you have to work more than twice as hard as any male. Sorry, but it's true. Because if you're a male, it's much easier to get acceptance, especially when you have some findings, some evidence that doesn't agree with what everyone believes. I've always thought, if I were a male, and maybe I should dress up as one, then I could be up there and give them the same lecture, and they would say, that's interesting, that's a good discovery, but because I'm only a woman up there, I'm called all kinds of names. It goes from Danish bitch, and they think that I'm a Danish instead of Swiss. To all kinds of much worse names.
Maybe I can follow up on this.
Yeah,
at the time. But I think what I'm going to bring in perhaps is two perspectives. One is that geography is a discipline. It shares some similarities, I think, with the geosciences, but there's some differences.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is for me being a man, but also in a very particular position. And I think what struck me, Gerta, when you told me of how you started your career, was also how you had a minority opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that complicates the issue. So not only were you a minority person, socially, woman was not from the United States, or from a Muslim background, but you also had a minority opinion, right? I think that's something that in geography is discussed quite a bit, is also how certain things are seen as worthy of studying because they are being proposed by the majority, by men. And other things are not worthy of studying. And I think that goes back to what Allison said also about the field sites. In geography, we had in the 80s, 1990s, there was a big shift towards studying the household, the home, which was only seen as a private and women's thing, and no man was interested in studying the home as a field site. Since then, it's become very established, actually, the geographies of the household, the geographies of home, of intimacy, of private lives. And what we're seeing at the moment is an increasing interest in Black lives, Black spaces. It started at the beginning of the 2000s, where there was a very clear argument that places that counted in geography that were worthy of studying were white places, frequented by white people, and issues that were cared about by white people. And so gradually, with pressure, that's been changing, and I think we're not nowhere near anything that would represent any fair representation. But I think what I would find important is certainly also that what counts as valuable knowledge or as as good work can be very different from extreme environments. And of course, extreme environments kind of have a tendency of bringing out stereotypical gender roles in most of us, right? I did field trips as well, but only to Berlin. And Berlin is quite interesting because it's the gender dynamic is very different there. Often we get along much more easily in Berlin because they get along with the language much more easily. They're more happy in German. They can speak. They're more open to speaking to other people. So actually, they manage to solve the tasks in our field courses often much better than men, which is interesting for the gender dynamics. But the second thing that we have is also we talk about role models. Of course, men are part of the equation in a way. So, and I think what I'm noticing is in my own life, so my wife is a professor as well, and we have 3 children between 4 months and 5 years. And she does the commuting. So we usually spend, normal circumstances, spend more time with the children than she does. And it's very difficult often also for men actually to articulate that and to say, look, I need to leave at 5 because childcare closes at 5:30. Increasingly being accepted for women, but for men it's a little like, okay, why are you and where's your wife? Why are you doing this? And I think what we also need is male role models coming, basically, especially for professors who are doing this, because often you then have the inverse, like exactly, with the female professor who has the man husband tagging along and kind of taking care of the children. So how are we getting, which is basically the topic of the discussion today, to equality? Saying, okay, neither one nor the other. Then we need to tackle really also what is the professor's role. Are you really expected to work 150%? Is that gonna cut it? And if you multiply it by 2 couple, are you doing 300%? And then can you have children, or do you have to be in childcare from 8 in the morning to 6 in the evening? I think those are a little bit issues that I think the male role models also need to change. And that's what I see, certainly as one of my tasks as a professor, as somebody leading the team, is also to show to the men that you can actually take a step back, that you don't have to be present every time, and that you don't have to fight every fight until the very end. I think, personally, I've matured also along the way. I think when I was 10 years younger, I was much more insisting that I would work until very late, and I was fighting battles to the very end. And now I'm a little like, especially with the children, let it go, And I think that's important as well, that we move away from masculinity, the dominant culture, because both men and women can be masculine, I think, in culture, but more towards values that value a much more inclusive culture.
I think you're right. It absolutely goes beyond a gender issue, an inclusion issue, diversity, and having, shifting academia away from the fact that we all have to work every evening and weekends and kill ourselves working. As a woman, you have to balance having the physical part of having children. If you want to have children, that's something that affects women physically. But indeed, it's a family situation. We want to also move towards supporting families, and that's part of the broader inclusion and diversity that I think most people can agree on. We don't want to work every evening and weekend just to get ahead. But I think you're right as well in the sense that when you mentioned there's a higher workload for women to be taken seriously, I still feel that, even with little things like, writing an email or expressing opinions in meetings, sometimes I have to work harder to be heard. And it takes longer to phrase things in the right way that won't be immediately putting me in someone's head is like, oh, she's just, whatever horrible name people want to apply. Sometimes to women. So, indeed, these panels could always be broader. We could talk about inclusion more broadly in terms of races and so on. But for this one, it's equality of everyone for all. So, I said at the beginning we would have like half an hour or so of questions among the panel, and I've opened it up in the chat. If anyone watching in Zoom land wants to pose a question in the chat, feel free to do so, or to put your microphone on if anyone has a question they want to ask with the voice. We are here and ready to answer if people have a point of view. I don't see anyone. I've been sort of monitoring, no questions coming in. Yeah, so I guess then we could maybe shift towards maybe looking more broadly a little bit at the issues, and we've talked a bit about all of our experiences, but thinking about how we move forward. So one of the issues that women are facing is the idea of this leaky pipeline where there tends to be more women entering geosciences. It's still not 50-50. When I was looking last night, I saw in general, like women with geology degrees it's about 40% of recent graduates, so it's still not quite equal even at the bachelor's level, but then we see the percentages going down as we go up through the levels in academia. So there's lots of approaches that we could use to try to fix the leaky pipeline, but in general, how do we encourage women to get into academia in the first place, trying to get to equality in geosciences, and geo being geography and geology, and then keep them there? Do people have thoughts on what strategies work or don't work, or have been tried or should be tried?
I probably can say a couple of things. It's easy to attract women into geosciences because it's exciting. You make always good trips. It's always something exciting happening. And at Princeton, we have raised women, there are more women than men in geosciences now, quite a bit more. And in my classes, I've always had usually slightly more women than men. And overall in the department as well, obviously. I think it's not so much women in undergraduate or graduate schools for that matter. It's what comes afterwards. Men are more likely to get positions, academic positions, than women. Let's face it. I was the first tenured hired woman at Princeton ever. So, and took about 10, 15 years, more than at least 15, 20 years before they hired another one. And we're still only two. And this is 40 years later. So there is really no right to that. We are about 20 faculty.
And there's 2 women in
Yes.
20 faculty.
Yes.
Is Princeton or your department employing some, I don't know, strategies for trying to...
Started now. They've been trying for a long time to bring in more minority of women. And mostly the minority are simply women. Let's get any women in that are any good. It's about, here is the main problem when you bring in women. And you're probably one of the youngest, you were hired a year ago. It's, if you bring only one woman in a male-dominated department, you don't have much chance. Nobody's going to be your mentor. You will mentor boys, men. The women are sort of, let's fulfill that niche, the minority niche. And when it comes to tenure decision, the males will win. And so it has never worked. None of the women, young women that we hired ever made it to tenure. So we hire them for 3 to 5 years and then they're out. And they say, okay, well, 5 years at Princeton, you have your good record, send it back and you can find some place in a lower place. academic institution. So the point that has changed as of a couple of years ago, and it's actually the administration that has tried to influence it, but also ask the department to come up with a different strategy. Now, the good strategy is they employed it actually with young guys. Hire 3 to 4, hire a cluster at the same time in the fields that are close enough that they can actually bond and even interact. And that way, it's a small group that actually can support each other. And then they can move on together. And then the same thing when it comes to tenure decisions and that. And with the guys, well, 3 out of 4 have moved forward to tenure, and they all have tenure. So now we have, as of last year, just before COVID, so they've hired 3, they have hired another one now. I think it's now 4 or 5 that have started. So now, hopefully that they will be able to actually do what the guys did preceding them. They have actually bonded very strongly. Several of them have collaborated. Or at least they go for lunch and talk science, and it's a support group, actual support group. The faculty has to mentor. So they choose certain faculty that are close enough to those fields to monitor them, and there is every 6 months some meeting. Make sure they're on the right track. They need to do the same thing for the women. And then hopefully in the next 5 years, we'll find out whether it actually works. But at least for the women itself, it's going to be an easier route to go that way than if you're just one person there. And then you have to figure it out all yourself. You don't really have anybody to talk to. Really. So
the tenuring barrier is like it's not even just getting hired; it's then also making tenure. That's in the American system is a huge barrier. Here, it's not quite so harsh.
The hiring as a young woman, that's easy, reasonably easy, if you can make it to that level. Getting tenure, biggest hurdle. That really is. And you have 5 years to get to that. And if you don't make it, but that depends also on what your colleagues think of you. Because let's face it, it's your colleagues that are making the decision whether you're valuable enough to move up the ladder. And women are usually not valuable enough. I was lucky I never had to go through that barrier because I was hired with tenure. And that was because I worked, after my PhD, I worked for 4 years at the US Geological Survey. And I did all kinds of pretty visible projects, controversial as always, of things that I just, it's not that, I'm often called, let me justify this, I'm often called a contrarian. I'm not really a contrarian. I'm looking for truth in science, and I'm not a follower. So I look for things that I suspect are not quite the right things, and I look into it and collect a mountain of data, evidence. And then when I'm convinced that it isn't what it has always been accepted, then I go forward, and then you get slammed. That's the point that's the hardest, because if it's a male who goes forward with that evidence, will be, gee, this is really a great, instead of genius, this one is really doing great. But if you're a woman, and it's something completely different. And as somebody said, yes, I was also a foreign woman. But that was actually easier than being a native. Because as a foreign woman, they could dismiss me easily. Certainly, and criticize and all that. But it didn't really bother me because I was not part of their culture. While it was a native woman, they cannot take that. So they actually just give in and go with the flow, in the US at least.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, let's face it, we all have a hard road to go. No question about it.
But indeed, we should. What sorts of things do we all think we should do? I mean, we shouldn't just accept that it's harder for women, and that's the end of it.
No, but you have to fight them.
Yes.
The only way to go forward is to fight them. If you give up, then they will even view you as less. If you don't give up, then fight them and let them know what you're doing is actually the evidence, and this is what it is. It may take a while, and you're going to suffer from it off and on. But eventually you get through, and then if you don't, somebody else is going to pick up all your ideas and your work and come out and get the credit for it. That's for sure what is going to happen.
Actually, I didn't imagine that it was still so tough now. I mean, I thought it was something from the past.
It's something from the past, but if you work in a field that is very popular and has made people famous for the discovery earlier on, and you say, look, it's really not quite like that. In fact, they were all wrong. Then you're fighting, in my case, you're fighting the United States, the whole group. And then it's, well, it's like having a war. It's like we call it the dinosaur wars.
Indeed, there's like the side of paleontology to do with dinosaurs, which is very big, very public.
And it's popular. And
it's popular. It has some quite large, like, male names associated with some of these famous dinosaurs, historically speaking. Yeah. Paleontology is a field where you, I'm shocked you had to experience death threats, but in some senses I'm not that shocked, because paleontology can be very, very cutthroat. People can be very, just getting grant reviews back sometimes is a soul-destroying experience.
It's amazing. But I can also say, I'm very happy I've been called once that, more than once, I'm also the most dangerous woman in the world.
I get that printed on a t-shirt.
I thought that was great.
Whereas you are not working on tyrannosaurs or something. Maybe we can say, I don't know, it's my opinion, but I came to this faculty more than 10 years ago. At that time, there was no woman professor. Not at all. And now there's more women.
Yes.
So I have to say that my experience here is that things are going much more better. Virginia and Allison are here to testify about that, I think. So I have to say I don't want to stay on this experience, which is so terrible, actually. And there's also other places other ways to manage the place of women in science, also in paleontology. So that
It's not just paleontology, it's every field, geosciences.
every field. Well,
Yeah, it just depends on, and it's not just geosciences, it's in physics, in chemistry. There are quite a few books out. There's another one coming out written by 3 astronomers, and it's called Reinventing Science. And it goes through every, essentially the whole book is about women in science and how they have been virtually ignored, become famous in their very old age by the time they reach 90, or while they are underground. I've read some of it. I was contacted because they included me as one of them. And and so I started reading a little bit. I was suspicious. I don't think that astronomers or astrophysicists have any sympathy with my side of the science. I'm not talking about me. I don't feel sorry about myself. I enjoyed what I did. And I fought simply because I never give in. So it's that. And somehow if you're a woman in science with mostly men in the science world, you've got to stop giving in. You've got to fight your way through. And you know, it's even satisfying to do so. Sometimes you get totally destroyed and you have to pick yourself up again, but you never show that. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I'd just like to come in here. I think there's also another strategy. Strategy could also be to make giving a virtue rather than weakness, and to say that you don't have to fight it out until the end, and maybe to admit error is also a potential strategy that would serve my male colleagues, our male colleagues, very well as well. So I think there we need to be cautious not to emphasize that one needs to be better than the men in order to win. One needs to bring better data, I think, because that risks recreating also some kind of, women as supermen, as it were, in a very literal sense. We should do better in order to win. I think there's certainly also an element of changing the culture, admitting error, of kind of, retracing your steps, perhaps a little bit of humility as well. And that could also change a little bit, that we need not to fight until the very end.
But this is not about winning, it's about truth in science.
Well,
that's what I mean, not to give up. If you find the evidence that contradicts what is being led today, like that a meteorite impact killed the dinosaurs, and if this is entirely true, and you have a mountain of evidence that this is not true, don't give in. If you give in, that's kind of saying, oh, poor woman, can't find them.
I think what was trying.
It's not, I agree with you completely. It's not, if I were just to fight because one fights for winning, that's something completely different.
I think what I was also referring to is people clinging to their theories, although they are obviously proven wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be a virtue to be giving in. I think coming from the social sciences, of course, truth becomes the relative, because it matters a little bit, what are you trying to find the truth for? What is the subject that you're interested in the first place? Often truth is very elusive. We have different interpretations of the same event. And I think certainly for us in the social sciences, I would say that sometimes actually allowing multiple positions or multiple truths little interpretations as it were of the same data.
Yeah, but you can't do that when you're moving into real science.
That's quite possible.
You see? You can't say, okay, we have multiple sciences, multiple truths. One is that the meteorite hit, the other one is the volcanism hit. And so both can be right. They can't be right at the same time.
But you could also think about probabilities, right? You might not at the end find the absolute truth, but with absolute certainty.
No, there is no absolute truth
Yeah.
unless you're in mathematics.
You know,
So, and my husband was a mathematician. He died 3 months ago.
I'm sorry.
So it's not that what we are looking for, the absolute truth. But when you build up so much evidence, and for the impactors, all they are left with strong evidence is that the iridium is extraterrestrial from an impact.
Right.
And even that is destroyed. That's the last pillar they have. And even that actually at the end now, because it isn't. It is from inside the earth, coming out from through volcanism. So it's the social science argument does not fit this model. It simply doesn't. In social science, yes, I used to be in archaeology. And truth is, I found whoever won the argument is whoever could speak the longest and shout the loudest. And that took me out of it.
That kind of situation, indeed, what you're both sort of saying about changing the culture, and indeed, you know, holding on to the data, what the data show in whatever the data are in any field, but also like opening up the culture that it doesn't just have to be that we have to be super strong and power our way through, and that's the end. There's lots of ways to evaluate how people do their science, and I think it is getting better. You know, the hiring you mentioned is getting better. At least, you know, there are more women here. So thinking of the Union example, through very specific actions to hire more women, and more broadly speaking, ways of evaluating science and contributions to science are also opening up with Dora and these sorts of things. So I think it's hopefully we are moving towards sort of changing a culture that there is one type of academic and it tends to be a white, you know, a male, but that, you know, we can open it up and change it with exits. So.
And I'm not trying to say that a woman has to be powerful and strong. When I give my talks, it's always subdued. There are no challenges there other than presentation of the data. And that's it. And what interpretations can be. And that, though, is more empowering than shouting. It is much more effective. And that is what gets the other side's anger up.
And I fully agree. I don't think we need to shout or to be stronger than male. But
no, you stay who you are.
Exactly. And we all know here, I think, that what is really important is science. And we try to do our best in that. But your question was what we can do. And I think, well, first of all, panels like this one or discussions like this one, so just talking about the topic is something that is really important, make it an actual issue. But maybe something that should be also considered is to revisit these pioneer works that were mostly published by white male scientists, and then try to find the hidden contributions and then put them in the same, at least at the same level, and try to show studies published by female or indigenous scientists, make them available to the students and colleagues. And so this is something that I'm sure help. And the other way is also, so you mentioned the leaky pipeline. So I think we should also change the view of just a pipeline. So like the scientific career is just one way to go there. And this is the beginning, this is the end. If you go out for any reason, then it's impossible to go in again. And so if we just change our view on this, for example, recently has been a publication proposing an analogy with braided rivers. So these are rivers with multiple channels, and then they split, they converge again. So if we just promote this flexibility in the scientific career, this would also help, especially female scientists, because we may face some breaks in our careers, but not only. And I think an important point that also was mentioned before is that it's a shared responsibility. It's not just our responsibility as a women that we need to, put everything now on our backpack and then fight because it's our no. This is something that is equally important for male and that we all should do together.
Absolutely. So we've already we've just reached the end of the time that we scheduled for this panel. I just wanted to mention that we had a comment from Franziska Blackman, who was watching on the Zoom. And she said, I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to say that I found this discussion and Gerta Keller's story really inspirational. As a female PhD student doing fieldwork in Svalbard, I can also very much relate with Fane's experience in the field. So thank you all for sharing. So, and I echo that. Thank you, everyone, for participating today and for this discussion. It was, I found everything, like your story was really inspirational. So thank you so much for sharing with us, like so candidly, what's happened during your career. I think it's so important to carry on these discussions. So many thanks to everyone watching on the Zoom, and thanks again to everyone here. And have a good rest of the day.
Thank you for the invitation. I told you a very minor reflection, but maybe in a year or so a book will come out.
Ooh, okay. Right. Women in paleontology.
No. It's called The Dinosaur Wars.
Okay.
That title is going to be a bestseller.
Yeah.
I should put it on the pre-order list.
So it would be a better last.
Yes.
Bring somewhere else for people difficult because we isolate.
Yeah,
So it's